This video is to cover the Southern colonies, which includes the Carolinas and Georgia. We're going to start first with talking about Southern colonies in general. And some information to know about them is that they are dominated by a plantation economy, just like the Chesapeake colonies were as well. In the Chesapeake, it was tobacco. In the Southern colonies, rice is a huge crop. Slavery is going to exist in all colonies, including Georgia after 1750. There were mostly indentured servants until the late 17th century in Virginia and Maryland, but it's going to increasingly become Black enslaved persons after that. Large land holdings are going to be controlled by aristocrats, and so you will have a social structure that you will see on a later slide, except in North Carolina and parts of Georgia in the 18th century. It is very sparsely populated, so as a result, there's not a lot of churches and schools because they're too expensive to build for small towns. This is going to be a contrast to the New England colonies when we talk about that. There is a degree of religious toleration. They followed the Church of England, which is also known as the Anglican Church. And in addition, there is expansion. There are desires to find new lands to compensate for the fact that existing lands had been depleted, the soil due to tobacco and other farming. And this expansion is going to lead to conflicts with Native Americans. We consider the area of the Carolinas and Georgia to be considered part of the Deep South. And I'm going to start, first of all, by talking about the Carolinas. And there is a little bit of historical context to explain as far as just the Carolinas in general. And that is that the American colonization was interrupted during the English Civil War of the 1640s and also Cromwell's protectorate in the 1650s. New colonies were not founded again until the restoration of Charles II between 1660 and 1685. These restoration colonies included the Carolinas as well as New York and Pennsylvania. The Carolinas are heavily impacted by the British West Indies. The West Indies is in the Caribbean, and you can see the picture here, especially Barbados, which is bolded there on the bottom right-hand corner, sort of. And they had developed a sugar plantation economy, and enslaved persons had been brought to the British West Indies and outnumbered whites 4-1. Slave codes had also been adopted in Barbados to control these enslaved persons. The West Indies increasingly came to rely on mainland British America for foodstuffs. And as sugar plantations began to crowd out small farms, many of them came to Carolina with a desire to recreate what they had already established in Barbados. They came with enslaved persons in order to farm. Carolina is going to adopt the Barbados Slave Code in 1696. Carolina is created in 1670 after the Restoration and named after King Charles II. Their goal is to grow food items for sugar plantations in Barbados and to export non-English products like wine, silk, and olive oil. They are going to export Native Americans as slaves to the West Indies and English colonies as well, perhaps as many as 100,000. There will be a rebellion of the Yamasee tribe in 1715 against advancing settlers and corrupt traders from Charleston who captured and sold Indians into slavery in Barbados. Rice will become the main cash crop in Carolina for export. By 1710, blacks outnumbered whites. In fact, this is the only colony of South Carolina specifically to have a black majority population, so that is important to know. After 1720, black slaves are going to pour into the Carolinas, and before that, you had small African population, and that were largely from Barbados, as previously mentioned, and they had been skilled with forestry, lumber, cattle, and the initial plan was to recreate the sugar plantations, as I mentioned previously. They had cleared the land for white settlers. The land was not good for sugar, and so that is going to be really important in the story of slavery within South Carolina in particular. Additionally, South Carolina is going to be dominated by rice, as you can see from this PowerPoint slide. And they have marshlands that make it easy to grow. This is going to increase the enslavement of West Africans who are skilled in labor and useful to grow these items. They're going to spend a lot of time in the fields, and it's done in large gangs under very little white supervision. So you're actually going to see this as the location of the first African American culture because they're going to have a lot of time on their hands, unsupervised by whites, to be able to develop their own language, which is called Gula, that whites did not understand, and it allows for them to share African religions. The work is laid out under a very specific task system where they're given certain amounts of time each day. And once that work is done, then they have time to themselves. And that's why they're going to develop a rich culture. In addition, Charleston, originally known as Charlestown, became the most active seaport in the South. It became a center for aristocratic younger brothers of English aristocrats. Remember, the primogeniture laws had dictated that only the oldest son inherits the land, and so many of the second and third sons are going to come to America in order to have their own lands. Religious toleration does exist, and Native Americans and Spanish soldiers, however, will attack Southern Carolina settlements as they opposed English settlement. North Carolina, as separate from South Carolina, will be officially created in 1712 as a refuge for poor whites and religious dissenters from both Carolina and Virginia. There are a lot of squatters, individuals who come here without any property rights, and they just squat on the land in hopes of becoming the owners. This became the most democratic, independent, and least aristocratic of the original 13 colonies. It's similar to Rhode Island in that case. Tobacco became its main export, similar to the Chesapeake. They treated Native Americans ruthlessly and sold many into slavery, and they had no large plantation economy because of the land. And here is a map that shows you the Carolinas as well as Georgia. And specifically talking about Georgia, it was founded by James Oglethorpe as a haven for debtors, as well as a buffer state against Spanish and the Native American incursions from the South. Spain was in control of Florida at this time, so Georgia was seen as this extra colony that could protect them from attacks, because remember that the farther north you went, the more wealthy the economies were, with rice and tobacco and indigo as well, that were very important. So Georgia was seen as a buffer zone because it wasn't as crucial for farming. In addition, you have it initially prohibited free blacks or slaves from living in the colony because of the fact that they were afraid that slavery might take root there, and eventually it does. But by the American Revolution, it had incorporated rice and indigo production worked by enslaved persons. Savannah will emerge as a diverse community. It'll include German Lutherans, Scottish Highlanders, but no Catholics. So there is a degree of religious toleration. English settlers will make up the lower proportion of the colony's population than any of the original 13 colonies. And it is also the least populous of the 13 colonies. And as mentioned above a little bit more, it's a haven for people that were in debt. They're going to be such a population explosion. Remember in England that they need to move people into different places, and one of those areas is Georgia. Interestingly enough, another debtor colony that was created by England is Australia. And so Australia was for a long time a haven for debtors. And that is it for Georgia. To go a little bit over Southern society in general, to give you a little bit more idea of what it was like, there is a Southern class structure from the most powerful down to the least powerful. Plantation owners are at the top of the social ladder. They have all of the economy that they rule, as well as they had control of the political power. Underneath them are small farmers. They are the largest social group, but they are considered very far below plantation owners in terms of prestige and power. Most of them live in meager existences. Some own just one or two slaves. They might have modest-sized plots of land. Underneath them are the landless whites. Most of them are former indentured servants who could not get land of their own. Below them are indentured servants, the lowest of the white individuals, and this decreases as Black slavery increases after Bacon's Rebellion. At the bottom were the enslaved persons. They were lower in class structure and constituted about 20% of the colonial population by 1775. Much of the South remained underdeveloped. There are very few cities that will emerge, partly out of the fact that life revolves around the plantations, and they don't really need to have large cities and large concentrations. They have poor transportation. Waterways are the principal means of transportation, but you'll see well into the time before the Civil War that they just do not have the infrastructure in terms of transportation that they do in the North. They're very far outpaced. And then the last question is, why did Southern colonies develop differently from New England? Well, first of all, there was a demand for labor of indentured servants in the South that there wasn't in the North. One of the important things to consider is the geography and the climate of the two different regions. In the South, you have long, warm summers with growing seasons, very short winters that are good for growing crops, such as there's also a very rich soil that allows for it. Whereas in New England, they had very harsh, long winters, very poor soil. It was rocky, and it just didn't take to be able to grow crops there, other than maybe a few crops for them to eat. And so part of it is the geography and the climate. In addition, women come in much smaller numbers in the South. Remember that I had told you that originally with the Chesapeake, that there were just so many more men, single men that came, whereas in New England, they're going to come as families. And finally, they're going to begin the importation of enslaved persons from Africa in the South, where it does not happen in New England. And that is it for the Southern colonies. Thank you.